Okay guys, today we're going to look at a revision for the paper 2 for the GCSE PE Edexcel paper. This is aimed at our paper 2 for 2025, so the one that's coming up in a couple of days. So I thought it best to do my best to help you revise. Now, this video is me cobbling together a bunch of the other videos that I have made, so apologies now if the continuity between the videos isn't the sections isn't great, but it's just a quick fix, so sort of putting all the videos in one section for what I think you need to revise. But just really quickly, I'll just go over looking at the past papers over the last couple of years and areas and things that I think are due to come up. Now, firstly, you're really only going to be facing one 9-mark exam question. But my advice would be to turn to the back of the page and look at it straight away at the back of the paper and just jot down AO1, AO2, AO3 as soon as you see it in the paper, just to remind yourself. Remember, AO1 you want to put 3 marks in, 3 points in, which is going to be probably defining whatever the question is setting itself out, and the key words in there, or putting some key facts about whatever the key term and the key content is. Topic areas for that question. AO2 will be the applied examples. So usually in paper 2, it's how they are seen in the situation that is detailed in the exam question. And then AO3 is evaluative points, and usually it's what's the knock-on effects, the consequences of whatever it is that you're looking at. So that's a slight difference between paper 1. It's more about what the consequences of it. It could be what the advantages are and disadvantages, and I'll talk about that briefly in a second. So the main areas that you already want to look at is the health classifications. So the video in a minute will just roll on through all of these areas, and you can skip ahead to them if you wish to, areas you want to look at, or you could even just watch the individual videos that I've put together on this playlist anyway. But health classifications, so you need to know the social elements of health, so you're on the physical, emotional and social aspects of health, and then there are a few questions that we'll go in detail in a second. Sedentary lifestyles, I think, is due to come up, the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle. Also, that's often a 9-mark exam question, or it's quite easily a 9-mark exam question. I'm not 100% sure it will be this one, but it's worth looking at it and revising it as a 9-mark exam question, because if it doesn't, it's still know it for the 2 to 3 to 4-mark exam questions. Diet will usually come up. I suspect it's more going to be on like macronutrients, and I've put elements of just macronutrients and some of the strategies around that, but I would probably advise you to look at the diet as a whole, including optimum body weight. There's a video you could always watch later on, the full video. I would look at hydration strategies, which I will cover in this video. Skill classification comes up every year in some manner, so definitely revise that. Guidance methods, I think, is due to come up, and again, if it's not a 9-marker, it will probably be 3 markers, 2-3 markers, or something like that. So I'd imagine guidance is what you want to be looking at. Now, in terms of practice methods, I would probably focus on more mental practice, mental preparation. Participation rates, and often the exam question referred to it as personal factors, so we'll go through that. The media and the impact of media on sport, I think, is due to come up in that side of commercialization. So I have done one recently, a big video on commercialization, but this revision video only focuses on the media aspect of it. But if you're more than welcome to go back and look at the commercialization parts of it. And then finally, sporting behavior, gamesmanship, deviance, sportsmanship. And again, that could well easily be a 9-marker. If I was going to really hedge my bets, I'd probably go with guidance and media. But it could be any of those areas. I'm just sort of guessing, educated guesses really. So with that in mind, this video carries on in a minute, and it will just cut to a bunch of different videos, different edits of the videos that I've done in previous revision videos, and just sort of cobble them all together for one last revision video for your exam on Monday. So best of luck. I really hope these help, and yeah, good luck with the exams, and enjoy revising, I suppose, if you can really enjoy it. So starting off with the physical benefits of health, and the first three areas you probably want to commit to memory are that exercise will reduce the chances of obesity, reduce the chances of stroke, and reduce the chances of coronary heart disease, or CHD. You need to know why each of them, what happens in the body to reduce those potential issues, and then an explanation of why that is happening. So if we start with obesity, that's obviously reduced when you do physical exercise. Yeah, I'm sure you guys already know that it's because the calories consumed are not being burnt. So if you don't exercise, there's a chance that we will put more fat on and store our energy as body fat because we are not burning those calories. So it depends on the wording of the question. If it's what are the benefits of physical activity, then we will burn the calories that we consume. And the reasons why this happens and it reduces our obesity is because there's an increase in metabolic rate. The metabolic rate is the speed at which we're using those calories that we eat, and therefore it maintains our energy balance. So the amount of food or calories coming in is equal to the amount of calories we consume. Our strokes are reduced. The risk of strokes are reduced because of our low density lipoprotein and an increase in high density lipoprotein. You'll get away with putting LDL and HDL, and essentially they're linked to cholesterol. They're just different forms of fat, and one is reduced and one is increased. So if you think about low is reduced, which is low goes down, and if you think high goes up, high it goes up in the air, so increasing in the high density lipoprotein. And this results in us having less plaque in our blood vessels. Plaque is the buildup of fats and cholesterol inside the blood vessels, which then restricts the blood flow. So if we've got less buildup, it means there's less chance of a stroke. And coronary heart disease goes down because we are removing cholesterol through exercise, which again fills up on the walls of our blood vessels, and therefore our blood pressure will decrease. So if we want to look at the emotional benefits of health, to our health, of exercise, so we start off with simple things like our feel-good hormones. Serotonin will increase. So exercise releases the endorphins, the serotonin and dopamine, and what that does is it makes us feel good. It helps us reduce our levels of stress, and therefore we feel better about ourselves. So our emotional well-being is improved. Exercise and sport gives us a sense of achievement. So you might have a body weight goal, it might be a competitive goal, but when we achieve it, you feel confident in yourself, and therefore that increases our mental well-being, and there's less chance of us having depression because of that. So our stress levels will go down, our chances of depression will decrease when we exercise, mainly because of the release of serotonin and endorphins I've just spoke about earlier, and therefore we feel good about ourselves. Our self-esteem increases, which is your self-confidence, and mental well-being is improved. So there's three sort of different areas. Now, when you're doing an exam question, it might ask you for an emotional benefit of health, which will probably only ask you for one of those. However, it might ask you like a 6-mark question, which is broken down into 2, just saying what are the benefits of exercise on health, and therefore you could choose one of the physical, or you could choose one of the emotional. So you don't need to remember all of them, but just at least one of them. Okay, and then finally, we are looking at the social benefits to health, and this question can be asked directly about the social benefits to health, or like I said earlier, you could just link it into a generic question that just says what are the benefits of health, of exercise to health. So the first is that we can make new friends, and therefore and the process of how we make new friends is we could be joining a club or working within a club, joining a new club, and we start to see people who are at the club at training sessions. This will improve, so that's the process, and then this is the outcome. It will improve your cooperation and your teamwork. How you do it is because you're working with others, working with teammates, and you are focused on a common goal. You know, if you're in a football team or a rugby team or a netball team, your common goal is to win the game, so you focus on that. And a bit more detail in that is you can improve your communication skills, things like calling for the ball, communicating with your teammates, telling them where you are on the field, and coordinating tactics. But also listening to each other is a social skill and a communication skill, and that could be just simply following the tactics and instructions. So really quick 3 revision points there then. So we looked at the benefits of exercise and sport on physical well-being and health, emotional well-being and health, and social well-being and health. So good luck. So in terms of what a sedentary lifestyle is, you need to know this very basic definition. So it's a lifestyle with little to no physical activity, and you might have to you might be asked a 1-mark exam question where you have to just literally write that definition in it, or it could be a multiple choice question where you have to identify it from a range of choices. Most often you're going to have to write this down, so make sure you've learnt this definition. And even if it was like a 9-mark exam question, which does come up on this area quite regularly, you'll start with that definition. So do learn what a sedentary lifestyle is. So sedentary means you're basically not moving around, so it's little to no physical activity. And there's another sort of example you could expand on it with not exercising on a regular basis. Now, another key term that is linked to this area is osteoporosis, and you've probably heard it before in other lessons, but you need to make sure you're very clear on what osteoporosis is, because it does come up a bit in this, and there's exam questions that ask about what things might cause osteoporosis or what prevent causing osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is where your bones become brittle and weak and more susceptible to breaking. So the main way to prevent osteoporosis is weight-bearing activities, so where your limbs are taking your body weight. So this is an example here where a multiple choice where you've got to pick whether it's aerobics, cycling, rowing, or swimming. And aerobics is the only activity here where your bones are actually taking the weight of your body in exercise. Cycling and rowing, the body is supported by the machines you're on, and swimming, the body is supported by water. So typically it needs to be an activity where you're running, jumping, or skipping, or something along those lines, where your body is hitting the ground and the weight is being transferred down through your bones to make them essentially harder and more dense, increase your bone density. So that helps prevent osteoporosis. So it's just something to remember. It could be a question on its own with multiple choice questions, but quite often students ask, what is osteoporosis? And that is it. And it comes up a lot in this area because if you have a sedentary lifestyle, you're not putting pressure on your bones, and there's more chance of getting osteoporosis. So the causes and reasons why people are more sedentary nowadays. Now, there are sort of two branches to this, and I'm going to talk about just the main generic causes and then sort of like the personal factors that might impact it as well. So the main causes are labour-saving devices, so things that make work easier. And around the house you have many labour-saving devices such as a dishwasher or a washing machine, and you just stick your stuff in them, and you turn it on and it does it for you. But if you are, say, hand washing up, you're going to be burning more calories than if you were just sticking it in the dishwasher. Other things such as automatic lawnmowers, automatic vacuum cleaners are the next steps up with these concepts of labour-saving devices, and what they're doing is they're preventing you burning calories because it does it all for you. So that's one of the main causes of a sedentary lifestyle. So you've got your example, you've got your point here, and then you've got your examples backed up with a specific example. So just remember that word labour-saving devices and an example of at least one. Now, transport has changed. Obviously, we used to walk, and then we started to cycle everywhere. But now, buses and cars are taking the place of walking. So you're not burning calories while you're walking. You're not moving around as much. You're sitting in a car, and therefore you are not being as physically active. And then other aspects of technological development, so yeah, TV, video games, they are more appealing than physically exercising and playing sport to many people. So and the video games are designed in that way, so to keep people addicted to it. And so is TV, really. So it actually prevents people doing physical activity and therefore become more sedentary. Now, other types of questions that you might get faced is what factors might cause a particular age group or a particular group of people to be less physically active or to lead sedentary lifestyles. So in the probably the most recent one is where it asks why young people are at greater risk of sedentary lifestyles. And what they don't really want to know is these causes. What they want to know is the personal factors that can affect it. So if it gives you a particular age group or a target group, so young people, age related, it could be gender, it could be ethnicity, it could be disability based. Just try to remember those barriers to participation. So for younger people, it's a lack of money. You know, older people have more money. Youngsters don't have the money to pay for the activities at the clubs and the health clubs and the fitness clubs or the sports clubs. There's a lack of transport. So if you can't drive or you can't get to certain places, then you can't take part in it. So you are often reliant on your parents to drop you at certain activities. And so until you get to a certain age, you are limited on what ways and where you can get to. So lack of transport is an issue for some people. And then lack of time. And this could be an older person's, someone who works full time, for example, has a lack of time. But yeah, generally kids and youngsters don't have the time because they're at school and doing schoolwork and school homework. So if you put in things like too busy doing exams and homework, you might not get the mark. You need to put in that keyword lack of time. So just remember the personal factors, and that links to barriers to participation. So what are the consequences? And this is probably going to be the biggest area and the most important area to sort of revise. And it's very similar to one of the other videos I've put together, which is the consequences of exercise on your health. And this is quite a similar area, so it's a lot of crossover. So revising this area will help you with the benefits of exercise on physical health, so and emotional health and social health. So we've done that video, and this is linked. So the consequences of not exercising, not taking part, little to no physical activity. Obesity, diabetes and high blood pressure, all quite similar sort of areas, and they're caused because of a poor energy balance. So energy balance is the amount of calories consumed versus the amount of calories burned. And if you consume more calories than you actually burn, then you are going to put fat stores on. Whereas if you can burn more calories than you consume, you're going to lose body fat. And if you can maintain the balance of between the calories consumed and the calories burnt, then you'll maintain your weight. So it's energy balance. If you don't maintain an energy balance, you have a positive energy balance, it means you are going to put on body fat, and then physical activity will be harder to do, and then you will struggle to actually start doing physical activity because you will find it hard. And that leads to things like diabetes and high blood pressure as well. You could link in the psychological and the mental well-being with depression is increased. Because when you're not exercising, not moving around, you're not releasing your serotonins, dopamine and endorphins, and you don't get the feel-good factor of exercise. And that means it can affect you psychologically. So you can feel lack of happiness, which leads to depression. You get lack of confidence, increase in anxiety, and lack of self-esteem. So all of these sort of areas are linked to depression. Back to the physical aspects, we've got increased risk of CHD, cardiac heart disease, and coronary heart disease, sorry, and it's because of a lacking the aerobic activity. Aerobic activity is where you're using oxygen to generate energy, and it's usually through sort of consistently like constant exercise, a longer duration of exercise, but maybe at a lower intensity. And impact on that is it can lower your life expectancy, so you're more likely to die younger. and that's a serious issue for many people. We've already discussed osteoporosis as a risk of a sedentary lifestyle, but that's due to the lack of weight-bearing activity, like I just talked about earlier, where you're not compressing your bones enough, the density of your bones isn't growing, and therefore there's a greater risk of injuries and fractures. And then finally, people will develop a poor posture, and usually because they don't have the muscle tone that's associated with physical activity and physical exercise, and therefore they find it difficult to perform daily tasks and will struggle with the performance of day-to-day things that they need to do. So let's look at a 9-mark exam question. And it will maybe say discuss the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle or something along those lines. So remember, AO1 is the sort of key facts if you get this exam question about something to do with the sedentary lifestyle in a 9-marker. AO1 key facts, the definitions, the key bits of knowledge. Okay, AO2, remember that's the application, so essentially examples where it takes place, and then AO3 is sort of the evaluative points, the analysis. So the easiest thing to do is whatever in any 9-marker, you need to define what the content or the concept is that they're asking you to talk about. And if it was if they're giving you 3 sort of different concepts, so if it was a diet question and they ask you about protein, carbohydrates, and minerals, then define those 3 things. So in this sense, we'll define what a sedentary lifestyle is, and you can even be practicing this as we go through it now. Then give some just basic consequences of what a sedentary lifestyle leads to. So we talked about these areas just a second ago. So all you need to say is why or how it leads to those potential consequences. And then we move to AO2 with the examples and application. So we go into a little bit more detail. So people are going to increase their obesity because of a lack of energy or poor energy balance, and we discussed that earlier. A lack of aerobic exercise, that's linked to the coronary heart disease, we just talked about that. Osteoporosis is lack of weight-bearing activities, and poor posture is just due to lack of muscle tone. So very much what we just talked about earlier. The slide beforehand, essentially leading you up for this 9-mark exam question. But then we've got to go to the sort of analytical side of it and sort of the explanatory points in this 9-marker. So reasons why you might have a lack of energy balance and leading to obesity is because of labor-saving devices. Why are we not burning those calories? Because there are things preventing us burning those calories. You could always talk about the personal factors that I've discussed earlier, but you know, the labor-saving devices is the main cause of people not burning their calories. I've already mentioned about reducing your life expectancy if you are lacking those aerobic sort of exercises. Weight-bearing activities are going to increase the risk of fractures and breaks in the bones, and then lack of muscle tone and poor posture can lead to injury. So if you were to take part in any physical activity, it might cause the risk of injury, or even just day-to-day activities could lead to an injury, but also the inability to perform everyday tasks. So very similar to the slide we just talked about, but we're now putting it into that 9-mark exam question, which it has been asked a fair few times. So I would suggest that you approach this revision on this page with the 9-mark in mind. And then if you get a 1-marker or a 2-marker on it, then you'll be smashing it out because you've already got the 9 marks available to you. Right, I hope that has helped you, and you've got the exam very soon, so best of luck with that, and I'll put a few more videos up probably over the next couple of days. So let's get into the big areas. So macronutrients, it's often asked quite a bit in the exam questions, and the way I've broken it down is into the 3 macronutrients and their roles and what they are doing in the body. So starting off with fats. Fats and carbohydrates, whenever you're talking about both of them, you're going to need to put in the word they're used for energy. The difference between fats is that it's a slow release of energy, whereas carbohydrates is a quicker release of energy. So both are used for energy, just the speed at which the energy is released. So if you're doing something that's under low intensity, that might be more of an endurance event, then fats will be a better source of fuel for the athlete. So fats is a slow release of energy, and therefore would be the primary source for events that last a longer duration. Whereas carbohydrates are essentially a quicker release of energy, and tend to be used in more high intensity activities, and such as games players and power and speed based activities. So make sure you've got an example of a sporting performer or event that would use carbohydrates. One of the key things you might want to talk about in your answer, if you're asked about what's the role of carbohydrates, is that it helps to recover, or taking on more carbohydrates help to recover glycogen stores. And essentially glycogen is the stored form of glucose in the muscles and the liver. So just try to get some of these key points in your answer. And then when we're talking about proteins, again, we can use that term growth and repair. They're used to help grow and repair tissues of the body, but essentially most common it's used to grow and repair muscle, but all tissues require protein. Protein, once it's digested, it gets broken down into a thing called amino acids, which are the building blocks of what our muscle is. And then when it reaches the muscle site, it then helps muscle growth, which is hypertrophy. So remember that term, hypertrophy, which is the idea that muscles are getting bigger, the muscle fibers are getting bigger. And why do we need bigger muscles? Well, it gives us more strength and it gives us more power, so you need to apply that into the sport. So if you look over this point here, the impact on performance, when we're talking about protein, if we're trying to get bigger muscles, it means we can throw the object further, so throw the discus further, throw the javelin further, or run faster. 100-meter sprinter outrunning their opponents, could be someone jumping higher. So why we need bigger muscles is to create that power and strength in those movements, whereas the fats and the carbohydrates, always just try to think of this sort of example: maintain your pace for longer, resist fatigue, run harder for longer. So try always to have what the macronutrient is, how it works in the body, and then an application of it, your example of it. So just try to remember those sort of three parts of it, and you'll be able to score reasonably good marks on each of those areas. The next strategy we're going to look at is carbohydrate loading, which is basically used for endurance events such as marathon runners. Now, that often comes up just as a multiple choice question: which type of athlete would use carbohydrate loading? Or what is the benefit of carbohydrate loading? So the benefit of carbohydrate loading is to increase our energy stores. So these are two typical multiple choice exam questions, 1 markers. But if we had to write a little bit more detail on it, we've got a lot on the screen that we can use to structure our answer. So the first thing, you would talk about who would use it: the marathon runner, the endurance runner, the long distance cyclist, someone who is performing for a longer duration of time. And straight away you can put in there why that person would use it. So they would use it so they can run or maintain their pace for longer and therefore get a quicker time. So you're saying who's using it and how it's going to impact their performance. So you can link those 2 points in straight away. 1 mark, 2 marks. Then you can get into the nitty-gritty of what the processes of carbohydrate loading is. So we start off with, and this is very summarized, we start off with low carbohydrates and high intensity of exercise about a week before the event that we're preparing for. So if it's a marathon, the week before the marathon, you would increase your intensity of training, but you would reduce the amount of carbohydrates your body is taking in. This essentially will trick your body into thinking there'll be a lack of carbohydrates coming, and when the carbohydrates do come in, your body will snatch all them up and keep them in the muscles stored for energy. So the way we do it is we taper our training. Taper the training means to reduce the intensity and the levels of training a few days before the event. And then around about the day before, the night before, you eat a massively high carbohydrate diet day before, the night before the event, and really fuel up with the carbohydrates. And because your body is thinking that it's not getting any carbohydrates, as soon as those carbohydrates land, your body will store them ready for exercise, or ready in case you're going to go for another low carbohydrate diet. And what that does is it maximizes that glycogen stores, the stores of carbohydrate. It's called glycogen in your muscles. You're maximizing those stores, and it gives you that little bit more energy, increases your energy stores ready to do the event. And if we remember going back to the application, therefore we can run for longer, we can maintain our pace for a longer period of time, which will essentially help us run quicker, cycle quicker, swim quicker and further, and therefore win the event. Final area we're going to talk about is hydration and hydration strategies. So let's break it down into two parts. The first part is, well, why do we need water? This light blue box is here. Well, clearly we need water to prevent dehydration. That's a given, but it's a given mark. The impact it has, dehydration will have, will make us more dizzy. It'll lead us to lack of concentration. It will lead to poor concentration levels, and it can affect our blood pressures. So these are the reasons why we want to avoid dehydration, or what we want to do is take in water to prevent these things happening. So the strategies, and often it will ask about a hydration strategy for an endurance athlete, or someone who's going to be needing water over a sustained period of time. So not a short event, a longer event, like maybe it could be a Tour de France, which could be multiple days of events, or it could be something as simple as a marathon. So they will probably give you the scenario in the exam question. But the first step we would do is to pre-hydrate. So 1 to 2 hours before the event, you're going to hydrate properly. So make sure you take in enough liquids to get you through the beginning of the race. And once you've talked about the pre-hydration, talk about the post-hydration. So after the event, we've got another 1 to 2 hours of replenishment of our water. So we've got pre-hydration and post-hydration, just two simple ways of talking about when to take in the water. Then the next point is we talk about during the event. Okay, so during the event, you've got really two sort of options. You could either carry the water as an athlete, and you could use things like the water bottles that are stored on a bike. It could be a water pack, a camel pack on your backpack, or running with a water bottle. Or you can collect the water at fluid stations, which many athletes do. If you watched a marathon, there's loads of fluid stations where people can pick up water as they're running, and it's handed out by support teams. So you've got before, during, and after. And again, it's about 3 marks worth of questions there. So you could have the first 3 marks of why don't you want to get dehydrated, and then follow up with a strategy. So the strategy would be to pre-hydrate, take water on while you're actually doing the event, and how you would do that, and then following the event, what you're going to do to replenish that lost water. So that was a real quick whistle-stop tour of diet and nutrition strategies and types of answers you're going to need to put in your questions for the GCSE PE exam. So try to remember that, make some cue cards on what I've just talked about, and good luck. Hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at skill classification for GCSE PE paper, which is paper 2. We're going to be looking particularly at the continuums of open and closed, basic and complex, high organisation and low organisation. So just before we start going, we've got to remember that when we look at skill classification, we are looking at the two extreme ends of where you would put a skill. So if you think of it as a continuum, if you looked at, for example, a continuum where you might have happy on one end and sad on the other end, and every emotion between happy and sad would go along that continuum. We have the same for open and closed, basic, complex skills, high organisation and low organisation. So looking at the first one, we have open and closed. Now, the exam boards tend to want you to always put an example and note an example of an open skill and a closed skill. So generally, you're going to be looking at activities, and these are ones I've pulled off the exam board, the exam papers. So in the past they've used just netball as an example, a whole sport. They tend not to go with a sport in your examples, okay? Tend to go with a sport specific skill. But in general, you could probably pick most skills in netball as an open skill. Football dribbling, goalkeeper saving a shot. In this case, they've used hockey goalkeeper, but you could use a football goalkeeper or handball goalkeeper as your example, and or someone making a rugby tackle. And then other closed examples that they've used regularly is shot put, handstands, some high diving somersaults, which again could be replaced by gymnastic somersaults, trampoline somersaults. Javelin throwing and tennis serves. So just make sure you're very clear of the different sports examples that you can have when you're asked to classify whether it's open and closed. The other type of scenario you might be given is a skill that's already placed on a continuum and you have to justify where it is. But more often than not, you'll have the open and closed continuum shown to you and you have to then allocate a skill. It could be a multiple choice question where it gives you which of these is most likely to be an open skill, or which of these most likely to be a closed skill, and then it'll give you scenarios, and then you have to select the ones. But like I say, these are the ones that in the previous past exam papers have come up. Okay, so when we're looking at open and closed skills, we want to be thinking about how we define them. So generally what you would be asked is give an example of an open and closed skill, and then give a definition of them, or vice versa. So they're pretty much opposites when we're looking at these continuums. So as long as you can remember one side, try to remember the reverse of the other side. So generally, we want to talk about the environment and the stability of the environment. So the key words that the exam board likes to use is unpredictable or unstable environments for an open skill, where there may be some external factors influencing the skill. Okay, so wind might have an effect, rain might have an effect. Don't be tempted just to always go with the weather. Could be the influence of a crowd. It could be the positioning of opposition and your own teammates, which I'll mention in a second. In an open skill, the environment is constantly changing, so players will always need to react and adapt their performance to the environment that is changing for them. So example would be like you're reacting to where your players are on the pitch, where your opposition players are. So again, generally these tend to be sort of team sports. There are some exceptions of individual sports, but generally you're looking at a team sport scenario. A closed skill, remember we're looking at skills, not sports, is where the environment is stable and it's quite predictable. So it's the same thing over and over again. They don't really have much external factors, so the action is repeated over and over again. If you're thinking of something like a tennis serve, which is one of the examples the exam board use, even though the environment can be open, the actual serve is more or less the same in most situations, the same actions, depending on where you want to put the serve, but generally the same actions, and I'll talk about that next slide down. And you're not reacting to an environment, so things like a forward roll in gymnastics where there's no changes in conditions, the movement is the same movement pattern, they tend to be closed skills. So this is an example of an exam question where they've given you the skill of a tennis serve and they've placed it already on the continuum, and then they're asking you to justify why it isn't at the fully closed end. Now if you had this exam question and it gives you, and it doesn't have to be open or closed, it could be any of the continuums, but in this scenario it's open and closed, you start off with sort of justifying why it is at the closed end. So in this case we're talking about a tennis serve is performed in a reasonably stable environment where there isn't limited effect of the environment. But then you go around and say something like it's not always identical and the conditions can change when serving. So you're saying, right, it's coming back over towards the open end. And then you've got to give some examples of why the conditions are changing. So, for example, there could be external factors such as the distractions of the crowd. You could have wind that affect the ball toss. The surface could be slippery. The example, do give an example of the skill, the technique can change in the sun. that's up to you if you would want to use that one. Now, I don't think it would be the exact same question. It might give you a different scenario, but give you the same sort of justification. It might say, why is a skill more at the basic end versus the complex end? And you do this, go through the same process. So say, why is at that top end, whatever the scenario is, given a sort of statement to say it isn't always the case, and a slight reason why, like i.e. conditions can change, or that it's not fully at that end for whatever reason you're looking, depending on the example we're looking at, and then justify it with some backup examples. Sort of 3-mark question. So another sort of exam question that we've seen before is asking how a coach would organise their practice sessions for the open and closed skills. And you can notice that there's quite a lot on open and closed. It's probably one of the more likely ones to show up, but it doesn't mean it will definitely show up. If it was a basic and complex skill, you might want to adapt your answer for the similar sort of way. But it asks how you would practice these skills. Now, the first and easiest point is to say, if it's an open skill, practice in open conditions. If it's a closed skill, practice in closed conditions. And that's just really easy marks. And then you've got to give scenarios and examples of how you would set up that training to reflect open conditions or reflect closed conditions. So if we're looking at open, the sort of things you could be putting in place is putting pressure on the performers, and that could be in the terms of restricting time or putting time limits on it, or adapting timing of movements and things like that. Or you could look at introducing opposition. So it could be like an attacking drill where you start off with attack. And this is where varied practice comes in. With you start with an attacking scenario, and then you might put some defenders in place, and then you might restrict it to a 30-second time limit to try and create a goal scoring opportunity. But the idea is you're trying to get the players to learn how to adapt to game scenarios. And in closed conditions, really what you're trying to do is get the performance to be performed in the same way it would be in a competitive situation, where you're trying to get the replication. So it could be like I say, the example of tennis serve, or it could be a penalty where the footballer is taking the penalty, not the goalkeeper, the footballer, the penalty taker, and you're trying to repeat it over and over again. So you're ingraining how they perform it in the game, and you're trying to prevent any distractions. So you're limiting what distractions are around them, so they learn how to block them out for the games. Okay, so we move on to now basic and complex skills. Now, a basic skill is a relatively simple skill. It's a skill that can be transferred across multiple sports, whereas a complex skill is one that is more difficult and is usually a bit more sport specific. So these sort of examples the exam board give are things like running, jogging, different forms of running, like such as jogging, marathon running, cross-country running, sprinting. So any running action. And if you have to answer an exam question, think of a running action. I would go a little bit more specific. So give it an example of marathon running, cross-country running, rather than just running. Cycling and throwing a ball. They're the typical exam question sort of scenarios and examples they give. And then complex skills, and if you notice, they're all quite specific. They have the name of the sport and then the skill in the sport. So gymnastic vaulting, rugby scrummaging, tennis serves, dribbling and hockey, and so on and so forth. So if you're thinking about it, think of the specific sport skills that are probably a little bit more difficult. And always have your own sport in your background. What's the sport you play and what sort of skill is slightly more difficult in that sport. And then if we get to the definitions now, as I said earlier, basic skill is very simple to complete. It's less sport specific, so it's a generic skill that can be applied across multiple sports. And then we've got like two sort of sets of answers, and they're quite different to each other. They're opposites. So just remember one set and then think about the opposite for the other. So a simple skill. A basic skill is a simple skill where you don't have to think about it very much. You learn it very quickly and easily. Little concentration is needed, little thought about the movement, and less coordination. You think about when you go running, you might have headphones on or listening to an audiobook or listening to music. You can have conversations when you're running. You're not thinking about the running because it's a basic skill. Where if you're doing a skill such as a tennis serve or a cover drive in cricket, as the examples say, you can't have a conversation while you're doing those skills. You're actually thinking about those skills. So picture that in your head while you're doing these sort of answers. And again, complex skills, it's just the opposite. So you have to make lots of decisions. You have to needs a lot of practice. It's harder. It's difficult to perform. You need more concentration to perform it, more coordination. They have these elements where it's got a lot more bits to break down into the skill to learn it and subroutines. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more in organisation of skills. Now, this is probably the second most common area that they ask questions on. So usually it's open and closed is the most common, followed by basic and complex skills. So there's a very high chance that one of the exam questions will be focused on this area. And then that leads us to high organisation and low organisation. And like I alluded to earlier, less chance of this being asked. It is asked, but a little bit more rarely, usually on a multiple choice rather than an explanation. But that doesn't mean it won't come up in your answer with an explanation. So just apply what I've said about the other two areas and apply it to these ones. So high organisation, the only real example the exam board have given before is a golf swing. But think of a skill that's very fast and very rapid. But if you have to give your own example, think golf swing. In a low organisational skill, the typical ways is think about, can a skill be broken down into steps? So in backstroke swimming, you'd be using a float to work on the kicking action. Then you might do working on the arm action, not focusing on your feet, and then you put them together. Tennis serves, you might work on a throw of the ball in the air, then you might work on the backswing, then you might work on the connection and follow through, and you can break it down into its parts. So it's a skill that can easily be broken down into phases. If you take something like shot put, where you might go a standing throw, and then you might do a step, and then you can put a glide in place, and you can break it up into its parts. So it's a low organisational skill. Now, the examples, the definitions are quite simplistic, but it's one that people tend to get confused and they can't remember what's high organisation and what's low organisation. And the only way that I really remember it is I look at low organisational skills, and I think it can be broken down into its phases. And I think, right, low has 3 letters and can has 3 letters, and that's the only way I remember it. Okay, so low organisational skills can be broken down into separate parts, whereas high organisational skills cannot be broken down into its parts. And again, I look at the 3-letter rule of low and can, and that's my basic way of remembering it. It's not the perfect way, but that's the way I remember it. If it works for you, brilliant, use it. If it doesn't, then let me know how you do it. Smaller parts, so in low organisational skills, their movements have little parts. You can put them together, but you can practice them individually, put them back together to complete the whole skill, whereas a high organisational skill, it's too fast, it's too rapid, it's too powerful, so you can't break it down into its parts easily. So try to remember those two definitions. But like I said, focus firstly on open and closed skills, because they're the most likely ones to come up. Then you've got the idea of basic and complex skills, the second most likely to come up, and then high and low organisational skills. It would be good practice to think about how practice structures could be organised for each of those different classifications, or how a skill might fit and move across that continuum, not be fully at one end. If this exam question comes up in your paper, good luck, and yep, definitely revise this, because skill classification comes up pretty much every year. Hi everyone, and we're going to focus today on guidance revision for GCSE PE, and we're going to be looking at the 4 different types of guidance. You've got visual, verbal, manual and mechanical guidance. Now you've got to be wary of these sort of exam questions, because they do like to ask them as a 9-mark exam question, where they typically will ask you to compare visual by verbal, or visual manual, or manual mechanical, etc. So you need to know at least 2 of them in detail, and often they're in pairs, so that's be wary of that. You also need to know the advantages, like when you would use that type of guidance, and disadvantages when it's not such a good idea to use that type of guidance. So let's crack into it. Right, visual guidance. There's a lot of information on visual guidance. Comes up a fair bit in the exam questions, so definitely get this one revised. So what is visual guidance? It's quite straightforward. It's showing the performer what to do, and then having an example of how you would show the performer what to do. So like a video of an elite performer. So someone who's better than them is always a good method of visual guidance. Might be showing a replay of the performer themselves during the performance. It could use photos, diagrams, posters, etc. Anything that can visually stimulate an individual, or it could just be observation. So you pull a student to the side and then ask them to watch someone else perform the skill. So there are sort of examples of when you would apply, or how you would apply visual guidance. Now, the next bit you've got is the process, so a demonstration. It's a key word to have in there. If you get the word visual in there, make sure you add the word demonstration into your answer, but you should be demonstrating the perfect model. So it should be how it needs to look if done properly. Now this can provide a mental image of the action. So while you do it, you're trying to help the performer gain an image of what it should look like, and a mental image of that action, and gain an understanding of the skill. Also, an alternative could be like before they do the skill. You could then use it as a correction of errors, so they might replay the video themselves or observe someone else doing it, and therefore correct their errors in their performances. So always a good little thing to do. Benefits and the advantages. So as a general sort of advantage, it saves time. You can use it in large groups of people, visual guidance, so lots of people can watch it at once, and you can pass that information over very quickly to a large group of people. If students are watching their peers and someone who's similar ability to them, that can build confidence and motivation. So you might be watching someone who's the same level as you, and they can perform the skill. That means you feel like you can perform the skill. It is the best method for beginners, but only if the movement pattern is not performed too quickly, and if it is a quick movement, that it is repeated and slowed down, so it allows the beginners to really process that information and not become overloaded with information. The skill performance must be correct, and there is an exam question saying why must the visual guidance be performed correctly? Because the performers will then copy it, and if they're copying the wrong technique, they're going to learn the wrong technique. So it has to be done correctly. The other thing you've got to bear in mind is that the skill that you're demonstrating cannot be too hard, and therefore the performers must be capable of doing that skill. So if you're performing and showing them a skill that's well out of their ability levels, then that will impact their confidence and more likely to reduce their ability to perform it. Now I've got on here this little corner bit that says can be combined with verbal, and often your concluding point, if you're making a 9-mark exam question and your conclusion, it's always worthwhile putting in that the best method of practice is to combine visual and verbal feedback together to get the benefits of both sets of guidance, sorry, visual and verbal guidance together. Right, so if we get onto verbal guidance now, the opposite to visual, and again, like I'm reinforcing that point I've just made, most effective when combined with visual. So that's a concluding point if you've got a 9-mark exam question. Anyway, what is it? We tell the performer what to do, and then example would be an explanation, or expansion point would be to explain the skill or technique, but it could also be things like questioning the performer. It doesn't have to be before the event, it could be during a skill, so you could use it as a more elite level, or in a game scenario where you're providing quick tactical information. It might be moving positions on the pitch or on a court or something like that, where you're giving quick tactical positional information across. Is better for experienced performers, and the reasoning why is that as a beginner, they may not understand what you're trying to convey if you're verbally telling them. Beginners have a shorter attention span, and they might find the level of guidance boring, the type of guidance boring, so they prefer the visual and it's more stimulating method of guidance. Sometimes if the technical language is used, there is technical language involved with performance and demonstrations, then beginners can misinterpret that information, and this keyword here, key term here, information overload, can be problematic for performance. So getting too much information as a beginner, they're going to make mistakes. It also requires a high level of concentration. So all of these reasons are why it's better for experienced, or not so good for a beginner. Now, beginners also need to see the perfect model to be able to copy it, which is where it comes in well with visual guidance, and it's better to maybe demonstrate something and talk through the key points. So this will be your concluding point, your AO3, sort of on your 9 marker. The other advantages that we haven't really covered yet is that, or disadvantage, sorry, is that the skills are difficult to verbalize in a large space, or in sports halls where it's echoey. In a large environment where someone might not be able to hear what you're saying, it's harder to use. It's harder in large groups as well, because someone might become distracted and you as a coach might not realize that's happening. And some skills are more complicated, and demonstrating is a lot easier than actually explaining what they need to do. And again, that's reasons why it's better suited for an elite level player. Right, now manual and mechanical guidance have less information on them because they come up slightly less often, but it's still an area that is worth the revision. So manual guidance is where you physically manipulate the body of the performer to create the skill. So you're moving the legs of a performer, or you're getting the arm of a performer, and you're pushing it into a particular position. So often the exam board have quoted moving the legs in the breaststroke, so they might be on the float in a swimming pool, and then the coach is moving their legs in the action that it takes them to move their body. It could be hand supporting a somersault in trampolines. You might hold their hand and then they grasp it, and then you put your hand on the back and they flip over doing a somersault, and the coach will support that. Or it could be like moving the arm and lifting the tennis racket up, and the coach moving that arm up. So it's where the coach is physically manipulating the body of the performer. And essentially it's good because what you do is you put them in the correct position. You are helping the performer gain a feeling for the movement that they are doing. It improves safety. So if you're doing a somersault and someone wants to try it first time, hand supporting them is safer than just letting someone go off and do it on their own. And these reasons make it good for beginners. So beginners who are more likely not to know what the feeling of the movement is, and it's dangerous, might not have the confidence. It builds up these feelings and the safety and the confidence for a beginner performer. Now, difficulties are, the disadvantages are that the performer becomes reliant on that manual guidance, particularly if it's used for too long. And then when you take that guidance away, they become scared to try it by themselves. Sometimes the manual guidance puts the coach in close proximity with the performer, and that can make feelings of uncomfortableness with the performer, and it's not sometimes that efficient in large groups. Like I said earlier, it is very good when you combine it with other forms of guidance. So you can combine it with visual guidance and verbal guidance at the same time. Now, I've just whacked in here a multiple choice exam question, because that sometimes comes up where you've got to identify what type of guidance is happening. So which of these would be manual guidance? And you've got to explain how to position the body in badminton shot, which would be where you can pause the video and have a go at this yourself. Moving the player's arm through the correct motion of the tennis shot, using a float when practicing the swimming stroke, and then using video feedback to show correct technique. Now, each of them has one type of guidance, and it'd be worthwhile revising and adding these definitions to your repertoire. But the one we're looking at for manual guidance is moving the player's arm through the correct motion of a tennis shot. Okay, and then the final one is very similar to manual guidance. This is mechanical guidance. It's very similar, and you see the points are quite repetitive. So definitely revise this area because they cross over quite nicely. So mechanical guidance is where the coach uses a piece of equipment or an aid to try and move the performer or get the performer into the correct technique. So in trampolining, you might have a rig or a harness where you belt the individual up and then you hoist them in the air while they're doing somersaults. Swimming, they use floats, so you could isolate a leg kicking when they're holding their float in as they're swimming. And then you could, another aspect that is easy to do is just to break a skill down, any sort of skill, and isolate particular parts of that skill. So that's sort of why you would use it. Now, again, these are very similar to what I've just talked about of the manual guidance, so I'm not going to repeat them too much, but you put the person in the correct performer, you get a feel of the movement, also known as kinesthesis, where you feel how it should go and then you try to replicate that feeling. Increasing safety is very good for beginners for these reasons, and it builds confidence. And again, the disadvantages are very similar. So too reliant if you use it too long, and become afraid if you take the support away, which then can impede progress because they don't feel they can do it without that support. It's not the most efficient in large groups because it takes time to put people in and out and so on and so forth with the equipment, and it takes time up. Sometimes performers can be demotivated if they're used for too long because they don't feel they can do the movement without themselves. They don't feel that they are doing the movement themselves, so they don't feel they can do it without the support. So as you can see, there's a lot of crossover between manual and mechanical guidance. It's a nice one to revise because it could ask you a question on either of the two. Just remember that any of those forms of guidance, and if you've got AO3, your concluding points would be that the best practice is to combine them with other forms of practice rather than just relying on one type of guidance. So I hope that helps, and good luck in your exam. Hi guys, this is going to be a really super quick video on mental practice revision for GCSE PE Paper 2, and there aren't often a lot of long exam questions on this area, so really you're probably looking at a 3 to 4 mark exam question on this, so it's going to be quite short and we'll just go over the basics. Now, mental practice is the visualization of a skill or a performance. So you might visualize in your brain, the mind's eye, and picture yourself doing a performance. Now you might focus on the course specifically, so a bobsleigh runner would work on visualizing when the bends are and the different turns are. It could be a cross-country runner. Think about what's the start and where are different challenges throughout the course. Could be a relay race where we're looking at different changeovers. But you're focusing on specific aspects of the performance. So an alternative example might be an athlete, a jumper, like a long jumper or something, working on the flight, takeoff and landing, things like that. So it's picturing your movements in your head and visualizing that performance. Now, other aspects you could use to recall successful performances and think back rather than practicing what you're going to do, but actually think about when you last did this. So, and that can be improving your confidence. It can help focus your attention and then therefore reduce your levels of anxiety and stress because you're more confident about performing a particular skill because you've done it before and you're picturing that movement in your mind. Now, very often, mental practice is ritualistic, where performers will do it on a regular basis, like before the event. Might be a 100-meter sprinter, just picturing their race just before they go into just get into the blocks. So they're the sort of things that are what mental practice is. And the benefits of mental practice are things like it can help you block out the crowd, which in turn will help you get into the zone. Okay, now the zone is like the optimum level of performance where you're focusing just on that skill, and then there's less chance of creating errors in your performance. And in turn, that helps you maintain your focus and concentration span. So just that one thing of blocking out the crowd and getting in the zone is all linked to your focus and concentration. The other aspects is, and we've talked about it just previously before with the visualizing previous performances, but if just visualizing success, you're about to go into a race, you're picturing yourself winning, it's going to increase your self-esteem and confidence, it's going to help you reduce your anxiety and stress, and also calm your nerves just before that race. So that's a really quick revision video on what mental practice is and how it can be done and what some of the advantages of it are. And that's pretty much what 3 or 4 mark exam question will be focused on if you get it on mental practice. So I hope that's helped. Good luck in your exam. Okay guys, we're going to look at the personal factors that influence people's ability to take part in sport and activity. This is for GCSE PE Edexcel syllabus, so paper 2. So when you get these exam questions, what we mean by personal factors, and the exam question will mention the word personal factors, what we're looking at is target groups when we group people together and what those people's barriers may be. Now typically these are the 5 that the exam board cover: disabilities, gender, age, socioeconomic and ethnicity. And again, like I say, we have to cover the barriers to these people as well as maybe some of how their groups might affect their ability to take part in sport. Now, when we look at the exam papers and the likelihood of questions, we're really going to be focusing on age, socioeconomic ability, socioeconomic background, and disabilities. So looking at disabilities in terms of the personal factors, we are looking at sort of the barriers that prevent, and most exam questions are focused on the main barriers. Now, when we're looking at barriers, we always want to look at these key terms: opportunity, provision, and esteem. Now, opportunity means things that are that people have available to them. Okay, so it's more of a personal thing. So opportunity could be down to things like how much money they have or how much free time they have. Provision is what's put on by outside people or outside organisations, or what's available to them to take part in. And then esteem is a personal, emotional side of it, their confidence and their feelings. So when we want to revise it, you won't necessarily be asked about opportunity, provision, and esteem, but it's good to try and think of, can I break it down into opportunity, provision, and esteem? So when we're looking at barriers to people with disabilities, they tend to have less access to clubs, less opportunity to be able to get to those clubs because one, there are less clubs available to people with disabilities, in local areas, and that's why they have less access. And obviously their disabilities make it harder to get to those places. They have limited facilities, it takes certain types of facilities and there aren't as many coaches. So that sort of comes down to provision. There aren't those things available to those people with disabilities, which makes it harder for them to find opponents, and it's difficult to travel to compete against their opponents. So that's sort of like the knock-on effect. Now, if we're looking at more personal side of it, their opportunity, typically the cost of disability sports is higher because of the equipment, the requirements of the equipment, for example, specialist wheelchairs and running blades and whatnot to be able to take part in those sports. So that cost increases, which is a lack of that opportunity for people with disabilities. And then we can look at things that might affect their esteem. Well, firstly, there's a lack of role models and people in the media with disabilities. There are people in media, but not as many as mainstream. There tends to be a negative stereotypical attitude of people about people with disabilities and people who have disabilities, about their stereotypes of what they can and can't do, which has a knock-on effect, and that lowers motivation and it lowers confidence. So that's your esteem points. So these are all sort of the barriers, and their knock-on effect is it's harder to compete, harder to find opponents, and harder to travel. When we're talking about social economic background, we are talking about how much money essentially someone has. Okay, that's putting it in very basic terms. And we're talking about whether people have high income or low income, or high amount of money versus low income. So the questions tend to be broken down into comparing people between having high and low incomes. And we can look at the difference between expensive sports versus cheap sports. So obviously people with a low income will end up focusing on the cheap sports, and then people with a high income can often take part in more expensive sports. And it'd be useful to give an example for people in those situations. If we talk about membership fees, could come under that expense. People on low income have a limited access to those sports because of the membership fees, whereas people on high income can afford those membership fees. And if you think things like court and pitch hire or green fees, if you're talking about golf or whatever the costs of what you're paying for, the lower income can't afford them, whereas higher income have more disposable income and they can afford them. So golf is a great example. There's equipment costs that come into it, and if you think, right, people with a lower disposable income maybe might take up sports more like boxing with lower costs of equipment and athletics, whereas people from higher disposable incomes like skiing will have the money to buy that equipment. The So we do have these other aspects that you could link into it as well. So people from a lower income tend to have a lack of time, whereas people from a higher socio-economic income tend to have more time. And then you can take part in sports that might link to that. So sports that are shorter, for example, like games of squash, have a shorter time span, whereas sports that last longer, an example is marathon. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that that's linked to socio-economic backgrounds, but it's sort of the examples that the exam board would give you. And then finally, we talk about age. Please don't be drawn into the fact that you think that older people can't take part in sport because they're old and all the characteristics you might associate with getting old, about their physicalities and stuff. It's not about that. It's about the typical lifestyle factors that are linked to age. So we're not talking about old people, we're talking about adults versus young people if it's talking about age. Now, adults tend to have less time because of work, okay? However, so they can't take part in as many activities. However, they do have more money, so they can afford to take part in those activities. Now, you could talk about the fact and bring in elements of the fact that the older you get, the less flexible, the less strength you have, and there's more likely to have injuries. But and that could be one of your answers, but really do focus on the time and the money side of it. As you get even older, and if an exam question was talking about the even older aspects on that, you could focus on things like as you get into retirement, you do have more time, and the types of activities those older people in retirement might take part in that have a lot more time available to them, but their disposable income goes down, so they might not be able to afford certain activities. So they're the sort of things you could think about and bring into it every exam question. They do like to ask questions generally about young people, and don't be drawn into sort of saying that young people are more have more time at school and things like that. Start thinking about things that you can't do which your parents can do. So start thinking about less access to events because you have to take public transport because you can't drive. Think about that you have less money, you have less disposable income because you don't work, so you can't take up part in certain sports, and you're limited to sort of what's in your locality. So rather than sort of just traditionally saying, oh, you're at school so you can't do things, that's not right. It's about what you have, or what adults have, what you don't have, and what adults have and you do have. So, but you do have more time because you don't have as many commitments as an adult. So they're the sort of comparisons you might make. You could bring into elements like social media and technology could get in the way of taking part in sports. But let's stick to these simple areas here for this sort of this simple revision aspect. So that's just a real quick overview of personal factors. Hope this video helps, and the best of luck in your exams. So a slightly smaller area is the impact that rule changes have on games. Now what we're looking at here is how media might influence sport, and they might change the rules, and there's reasons why. So the first thing is, well, because they make the sport more attractive for a TV audience, and if it's more attractive, more people are going to be watching it, and it builds up bigger, and therefore it will be more likely for that sport to be televised in the future. This increases spectators, and then obviously if they've got an increasing spectator base, the media can make more money selling advertising space and linking in the business side of it. So there are a couple of advantages to making these rule changes. So firstly, it does make this game more exciting and more interesting. It can, by increasing the attacking sort of options and potential points scored. So these are sort of some of the ways that the game becomes more exciting, increasing the pace of the game and the speed of the plays and things like that. That would also help that sport as well. This makes it all easier to televise, and once it's easier to televise, it gets stuck on TV and more people watch it. The other sort of point the exam board tends to make, it keeps it fresh, so it's interesting to a younger audience. Now, one of the examples I'll give you over here is from netball, where they've changed the scoring system, and they have essentially a 2-point scoring zone, and usually it's only 1 point within the D, and then there's a certain period within the game where the final part of a quarter where there is an opportunity to increase the points scored if you're shooting from further out. That's a rule change to make it more exciting, to increase the points scored, and keeping the sport fresh. And therefore it's more attractive to be put on TV. And that's like example we've seen in the Netball Super League, definitely in England. Now, disadvantages. Disadvantages are that the timings of the games are changed, and because of these rule changes. Now, they don't. So just as a caveat on this area, there haven't been many exam questions asking about the disadvantage of this. So this is me just picking out areas that possibly could come up. So yeah, you could bring in the fact that timings of games and those sort of elements that could be linked to rule changes is a negative thing. It could increase the interruptions in the gameplay, and thus changing the nature of the game, from what existed, what it traditionally started as. The nature of the actual sport, the game, is changing. And then you could talk about the controversy around things like the rule changes, like the VAR. An example of a rule change is like in the championship in football, there's no VAR, but until they get to the playoffs, to get into the Premier League, then when there is VAR, so they're going through the whole season without VAR until one game where the VAR is involved. And the same with the FA Cup, the early stages there's no VAR, so the Premier League teams who are used to VAR don't get the opportunity, don't have VAR in their early games, and then as you get later on, they bring back VAR back in, which impact the lower level teams who aren't used to the VAR. But it's a rule change mid-competition, so that could be a disadvantage. Okay, so we need to look at the impact on spectators, and there are essentially sort of two sort of positives, and then there are a bunch of negatives. So if we break down this into the positives first, so more money from the media and more sponsors can positively impact the spectators, because one, the team can buy better players and they can build better facilities. Now, better players makes the game more exciting and increases the standards of the game and the team, so that's a positive for the spectators. But whereas better facilities makes their experience, the spectators' experience, much more improved. So going to a better stadium, it's a more interesting and entertaining experience for the spectators. And then we have the impact of increased TV coverage. So think about when you watch TV and sport on TV, you could watch it through streaming, or you've got things like the red button, which is a BBC thing. And that's a benefit because you don't have to necessarily go and travel to watch your team. You can watch from home, so that benefits the spectator in that way. So these are the positives. Now the negatives are as follows, and there's a bunch of different negatives, and you could just pick them up as we go. So the first is that more people watching creates an increase in popularity, and then the teams and the companies build on that, and then will drive the ticket prices up because it's in demand. So more demand, they'll charge more money for it. Now these 2 points both lead to expenses on the spectator. So sports generally now are behind paywalls, and what I mean by that is you have to pay per view, you have to pay for subscriptions. It's not just on free for view TV, so it's expensive to watch sports. And then obviously we talked about the driving up ticket prices with more popularity. It becomes too expensive for some fans to watch or to go to the games. Media controls sport, and in that regard, the kickoff times can be inconvenient, and sometimes we have Monday night football or Friday night football, and if you're a fan, say in the south of England, and your team are playing in the north of England, on a Monday night, you can't actually get to those games, or if it's a 12 o'clock kickoff, you might struggle to get to a game if it's an away fixture. So it can be inconvenient for fans with the media controlling when the kickoff times is, and generally they're controlling it, so they're putting it on so they can get the maximum amount of sports on TV and without competing games, so more people buy it, pay-per-view it. Some spectators suffer at the hands of corporate ticket sales. Now, corporate sponsors who sponsor the big events, they get given a set of tickets, which means there's fewer available for the actual fans. Often there's controversy because the corporate tickets don't get actually used. They're given away and they're not used. And the 2012 Olympics was criticised for that, because there was lots of empty seats where a lot of the sponsors were given these ticket seats, and the areas of the stadiums were empty because of it. And then finally, we've got the normal interactions with adverts, and that just makes it less appealing to spectators if it keeps cutting to adverts. So the breaks in play to get advertising in can lead to a less enjoyable viewing experience. So other questions might ask you, well, what's the impact of commercialization or media on participation rates? And generally these are 3 to 6 mark questions. So make sure you know at least 2 sort of these lines to help you. And remember, we're trying to look at the outcome. And if you look at these outcomes first, more people want to play the sport, more people can participate. That's where you want to get to. So let's start with this area here. Media will increase the profile of the sport, which is giving it, advertising it, and increasing awareness to more people, and therefore more people are going to want to play it. If there's more funding of the sport due to the coverage of the sport, then that sport can reinvest that money into the grassroots level, and grassroots is getting more beginners playing, and therefore more people can participate. Increasing the knowledge of the media is used to help increase knowledge of the sport. It could be the rules, it could be the tactics, it could be the skills. That increases people's awareness of the sport, and then they know how to play the sport, which means they're more likely to take part if they know how to play it. And then finally, there's been questions on some sort of developing sports or minority sports, and what it does is it creates role models in those sports, which leads to a shop window effect. A shop window effect is if you're walking by something that's nice, a window that's nice, you look at the shop and you're like, oh, I want to go in there. So it increases this shop window effect with people, and it's also linked to awareness, where people are more likely to go into that sport because they've seen it on TV and they've seen the role models, and that in turn leads to more sponsorship, which then creates a bigger cycle. That money can be invested in the grassroots level again, and more people participating. So there's this other aspect of media which can be negative. Sensationalism in the media is a negative aspect sometimes. So generally this is linked to sponsorship and media. So this is the full golden triangle in action at this point. So businesses will sponsor high-profile athletes who are role models, and they show excellent performance. So that might be your starting point in any question. Why does a team? Exam question might be, why might a sponsor withdraw their sponsorship? Why might a business withdraw their sponsorship of an elite performer? So firstly, why do they sponsor them? That's where you want to start with, and it's a few sentences to say an elite athlete, and they might name one in the exam question, is a role model, or they show excellence, so therefore they gain the initial sponsorship. Now the exam question might set it up in terms of give you a scenario where someone's taken performance enhancing drugs, or they've been racist or something like that. So generally the exam question will tee it up and say, well, why might they withdraw this funding? And you say, well, if the player's done something wrong, you're referring to one of these. So if it's something like performance enhancing drugs or cheating, it's bad because it's deviant behavior, or it's bad because that person then becomes banned from the sport. If it's something like racism, it's banned because it's illegal, it's a hate crime. So you need to think of the question and read the question carefully and think, why is their behavior bad? Then why the sponsor would, or the the business would withdraw their sponsorship. So in this sense, they don't want to be seen to support the behavior, don't want to be associated with the behavior. So they don't want to support deviance, they don't want to be associated with racism. If they do stay with the performer, then it can impact the sponsor, or they don't want to stay with the behavior because the sponsor, excuse me, they don't want to stay with the performer because it tarnishes their brand. It can lead to negative publicity and it can impact their reputation. And all of this is linked to money, and if that all happens to the sponsor of the business, they don't want to lose their sales or lose their customers. So they don't want to lose out on any money. All right, let's look at some 9-mark exam questions. Evaluate the impact of media and sponsorship has on professional sports performers. Now, when you look at this question, you want to break it down. It's into a few parts. We've got media, sponsorship, and we've got the impact it has on sports performers. So AO1, the key facts. The media, the money that brings that these media and sponsorship bring in can allow the sports performers to become professional, so it increases money. That's a fact. Okay. AO2 is the link to the media. Why are they being sponsored? Because they're role models, they're in a public eye, they're elite performers, and that's why it's seen on the media and they are getting given sponsorship. And then finally, we can talk about things like we talked earlier. The media will dictate when events take place, and that can then impact on the sports performance. So if we look at that's AO1. The AO2 would be what's the impact it has. So if we're looking at the money and the professional side of it, this increases the pressure to perform, to stay at their top level game, pressure from coaches. And then if we went straight to the AO3 point, we've got the links to the judgment we can make. So that pressure and the money can lead to them becoming more deviant and cheating or showing a win at costs attitude to maintain their standards because they're trying to meet their pressure and keep their money. If they're in the public eye, we talked about this AO1, any indiscretion can result in sensational news. It can be a lack of privacy. You know, they're in the media, so anything that someone does wrong when they're constantly in the media can then ultimately result in their loss of sponsorship, loss of funding, and loss of their income. And then if we're talking about the fact that media and sponsorship companies can dictate the events that sports performers have to go to, this means that the performers are a commodity. Now, a commodity is something that has value, something that can be bought and sold. They're not looked as people, they're looked as a profit-making item. So that's an impact on the performer because they lose their control and their power, and they're having then to compete in events that might be longer seasons, events that they might not usually compete in, and this could lead to an increase of risk of injury or burnout or shorter playing careers because they're committing so much to these events that are put on by their sponsors and media just to make their money. So that's a nice, simple 9-marker. And when we break these 9 markers down, I want to break into the AO1, the key facts. And this question is sort of like the impact. And we've got to look at this question as its impact. And then always just finish off with a judgment. Is it good? Is it bad? Here's another 9-marker, which could be going in any direction. And it's evaluate whether an under-15s football team should accept sponsorship from a betting company. And what we're looking at is gambling in this sense, but it could easily be switched out for alcohol, and that's been in a question before as well. So your key facts is, well, what's breaking the question down, what we're looking at sponsorship. So what's the benefit of sponsorship? Well, it gives you income. When we talk about the income, can be used, the impact can be used to purchase equipment. And then that improves the judgment. It improves performance. You know, you can buy it attracts better players. Better kit can lead to better training and therefore improved performance. If you're taking a sponsor, you are expected to display or advertise the betting company. Now, again, that could be alcohol, could be cigarettes. Now, it would potentially encourage players and fans and spectators to gamble more because they're displaying the advertising, which is the whole purpose of sponsorship, to encourage more people to take part in the thing they're sponsoring, or the sponsor is they're trying to advertise and get more people involved in that sponsor. So if it's betting, more people like to gamble. If it's alcohol, more people like to drink. So you can just substitute gambling and betting out. And the negative aspects of that is, it damages people's mental health. People become addicted to these sort of things. Damages your physical health if it's drinking. Then AO3 is illegal for under 18s. It talks just distinctly looks at it's a moral thing here. Looks at under 15s. So you want to look at the moral side of it. Gambling is legal. Drinking is legal. Vaping, smoking is legal. Depends on what they could interchange that exam question for. The AO2 is essentially the impact. We're sending the wrong message out to the players, to the parents, to the fans. It sends the wrong message out if we're then sponsored by something that's contradictory to legal or illegal. And then that could impact the reputation of the club. They're losing members, players, because parents don't want to be associated with that, don't think it's the right decision, so they leave the club. So always think, what's the key facts in the exam question? We're talking about sponsorship here, under 15s here. We're talking about the focus of the sponsors there. What's the impact? Okay, again, it's the impact of the focus, or the positive and negative impact, and then making a judgment, which doesn't always have to be negative, it's positive and negative. So break it down into those points. So starting off with what is deviance as the definition, and it's up here on the screen. It's when you're breaking the rules or cheating. So when you're not following the rules of the game and you're cheating, and most examples there, that would be AO1 point, and AO2 would be your examples. So things like drug abuse, match fixing, and violence or fouling of players, etc. Now there's 3 simple examples, and then I've put on 2 multiple choice type questions and say which one of these is deviance, and you could work it out through a process of elimination. You can pause it on the screen and figure it out now if you want to, and I'll tell you the answers in a second. So if we take this first one here, and it's always good to break these down and figure out if they're not deviance, what are they? So this point here, deviance would be the doping in athletics. The accepting referee's decision would be fair play. Shaking hands would be fair play. And verbally insulting a batsman in cricket is more gamesmanship. Faking an injury in football, missing a penalty, shaking hands at the end of the game, and taking performance-enhancing drugs. And you can see the theme of performance-enhancing drugs as deviance. Faking injury would be more gamesmanship. Missing a penalty in hockey, there's nothing, it's just missing it. And shaking hands is your fair play. So, reasons for someone becoming deviant, and this could be another fact in AO1 if it was a 9-mark question, or it could be just on its own, what are the reasons for deviancy. So we have essentially the extrinsic rewards. Extrinsic comes from external, so things like money and fame, prize money, things like that, reasons why someone might cheat. Other things might be pressures. So pressures from other people outside, the pressures from coaches, pressures from sponsors, and so on and so forth. Or it could just be dropping in performance and the inability to keep up with the performance. Maybe as a player's aging, they might take some performance-enhancing drugs to keep them going, which is in fact linked to cycling and sort of what Lance Armstrong did to continue being at the top of his game, which would be the AO2. If you're linking AO2 more generically, points here, the examples. So, the commercial side of sport gives players the sponsorship, and you could pick any number of players or performers, an example of why they may become deviant because the amount of money that they're earning is relevant. So Tiger Woods earns millions and billions of money, well, millions of dollars, any sort of player you could refer to. Pressures from others, so coaches might have pressures to keep their job, for example, and encourage deviance that way. Sponsors may demand performances because obviously if a performer plays well, it looks good for the sponsors and their products. So they have that sort of pressures on players to become more deviant and cheat. And then consequences. This is quite a big area, and it comes from different type of questions that you might have. So the generic consequences for the player is this section here. These are some examples, AO2, and this is more of sort of consequences for the sport. So I've broken it into player and sport. So if we take the player, the consequences could be fines and bans, could lose sponsors, the player could gain a bad reputation, and transfers and stuff like that might affect them, and they might not be snapped up in the transfer market. Could easily be stripped of the medals, and in other extreme circumstances could be imprisoned. So here are just some different examples where players or sports performers have been their sanctions for their consequences for their behaviour, their deviance. So Lance Armstrong was involved with Lance Armstrong was a Tour de France cyclist, and he one of the world's most famous Tour de France cyclists, most successful in history. Essentially came out that he was performance enhancing drugs, or was on performance enhancing drugs, and lost his sponsors as a consequence. Ivan Toney is a more recent football player for Brentford at the time, was suspended for a large portion of the season because of his gambling, and it's linked into match fixing, where you, as a professional footballer, aren't able to gamble on you. And he gambled on himself, or bet on himself, and he was suspended and fined for match fixing. In 2006, Juventus, Lazio, and Fiorentina were relegated because of match fixing. And another more recent one in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, the GB 4x100 relay team were stripped of their medals, their silver medals, because of one of the runners had taken performance-enhancing drugs. So you can see the consequences of the deviance, and make sure you know at least one of the examples, and I've given you 4 good examples that you can use. So as a sport, we have impact on the reputation for the sport, or it creates a bad image of the sport, which in turn leads to other consequences. So there's often a loss of income for the sport due to maybe loss of media and loss of sponsors not willing to be involved with a sport that has a bad reputation and bad image. It could lose interest in fans, so ticket sales could go down. It could lose popularity, and viewers could go down. So that, if you think about the golden triangle, is all a knock-on effect, and it can have a negative impact on the sport. And you could lose participation rates. So kids at grassroots level may not want to get involved in that sport, or parents might not push their kids towards that sport because of the bad reputation, the bad image that sport might have. The other thing that you could talk about, which I haven't put on the screen, but it could be that the national governing bodies spend a lot of time focusing on combating the deviance, and therefore they may focus on the wrong aspects and not develop the grassroots as much, and so on and so forth. But I'll stick with these points on the board and on the screen, and try to pick at least 3 of them out that you can just commit to your memory. Okay, so the next area we'll focus on is the difference between sportsmanship and gamesmanship. Often a very common question, just this first top boxes here. What's the difference between sportsmanship and gamesmanship? And I'm sure you all can remember sportsmanship is playing by the rules, gamesmanship is bending the rules. Then you've got different sort of ways of wording it. And sportsmanship tends to come up maybe a little bit more detailed than gamesmanship, whereas gamesmanship is literally just bending the rules and not breaking them. Whereas sportsmanship has all these other aspects like fair play, respecting opponents, being gracious in victory and defeat. Now, there are some other points that you could link into. We've got the examples here: shaking hands at the end of a game for sportsmanship, kicking a ball out of play if someone was injured, and these examples here that I've taken from the exam board spec. So claiming you've caught a cricket ball when you know it's at the ground first, time wasting, ball tampering, and so on and so forth. Now, the sort of stretching and challenging points you might want to be making, if it was a 9 marker, for example, or a little bit of a bigger question. Gamesmanship has increased in the past, and that's due to the commercial factors that we talked about earlier, the financial rewards for cheating. It's not cheating in this point, gamesmanship is bending the rules, but it has the same impact and the same reasons as deviance, the financial side of it. In terms of sportsmanship, there is some sports where they still have this really strong unwritten code of conduct, and those sort of sports you don't see a lot of gamesmanship in, so like tennis and golf, but they do creep in at some points. But there are some sports where sportsmanship is heavily associated with their sports. So one of the questions that would then go on to, once you've talked about the difference between gamesmanship and sportsmanship, is why is sportsmanship so important? Or why is it important for a professional athlete to show sportsmanship, and so on and so forth? Well, firstly, national governing bodies will always encourage sportsmanship, and they will do that through sanctioning negative behaviour, so sanctioning deviance in the normal way with fines, punishments, the sort of the consequences I talked about earlier, or they might add rewards. There used to be a spot on the Europa League in football where you could get on through a fair play spot, but that doesn't exist anymore. But there are always those fair play awards and rewards given to teams in, say, like the World Cup and so on and so forth. Now, that's one area that national government bodies really push for the idea of sportsmanship. But why are they doing it? Okay, so elite performers, they become role models, and it's always useful to put this point in if you get an exam question talking about elite performers and their influence, so they have a role model effect. And if they're setting a good example, their behaviour will be seen and copied by youngsters, and then that will filter down to the grassroots level. So, and what you'll see is there's a knock-on effect of those sportsmanship behaviours being picked up at the grassroots level with the youth sports. Performers are also always in the media, so, and if this is more about the impact on sports, the sport in general, so their good behaviour reflects positively on the sport as a whole, which then can lead to more sponsorship deals either to the performers or to the sports. And then that in turn should increase the participation rates at grassroots level. So both of them sort of have a positive effect on the grassroots level. So when you're seeing these sort of questions about sportsmanship, focus on like the good examples and then the impact it has on the kids at the grassroots levels. Okay, now this one question has come up once, and it's worth just having in the back of your mind about how it links into it. And this is questioning whether video replays are good or bad in sports scenarios, and linking that into the sporting behaviours. So video replays such as slow motion and VAR is sort of like your example if you were going to use this. Now, there are difficulties with it, other than obviously benefits of helping the referees make correct decisions and helping sanction players and trying to eliminate deviant behaviour. There are some negative sides, and those negative sides are things like it slows the game down because the pauses in play where you've got to check the videos and communicate with the assistant video referees and so on and so forth. But what it also does is it leads managers and the players to question the use of the technology, and it's currently a debate at the moment in the Premier League. It sort of adds to when you're questioning the validity of something such as the VAR system, it can players and managers and fans can lose confidence in the system. What it can also do is highlight incorrect decisions, and that sort of undermines the role of the referees. So again, that's a negative aspect of using video replays and the media showing video replays or VARs of games. And then also it might show the players getting away with deviance that they've been missed in the past. Sometimes though there can be retrospective punishments applied. Now, the other aspect that's linked into this, and this is linked to gamesmanship as well, is that people may feel that gamesmanship is an increasing thing, and it never used to be this bad, but it's getting worse. But this is probably the case because there is more televised sport and there's more media involved in sport. So we may feel that actually it isn't the fact that gamesmanship is increasing. It's just that we are more aware of it. So that's one sort of debatable question that you might put in, is that the AO3 sort of comments that you might make about gamesmanship and deviance in general, that it maybe isn't increasing. It's just more noticeable because of the media and the video replays that are available to us as fans. Right, so they're the main areas on sporting behaviours for you to revise, and good luck on your exams.